Ducks, geese and swans are the anseriforms, a large and diverse order of birds that are common in zoological collections. The ducks, geese and swans have been extensively studied in the wild, and their behavioural ecology is well known. There is a huge bank of wild literature that we can therefore use when we want to assess individual species responses to captive care. The birds you can see in front of me are a mixture of diving duck species, canvasback and bufflehead and ringneck duck from North America. These birds all share similar features. They're kind of built like a submarine, with their legs placed far back on their body, which allows them to sit low in the water and dive easily for their food. These characteristics of natural ecology and similar trends across species allow us to evaluate generalised practices of husbandry and management and enclosure design in zoos to see how well they fit each individual species and a related group of species overall. When we are considering bird welfare, it's really important to think about the things that they can do and the things they are restricted from doing when we keep them in the confines of the zoo environment. The work that we performed looking at different species of ducks involved direct observation of captive birds, direct observation of wild birds, and an extensive literature search to understand how do these birds respond to being in the zoo. This paper was published in 2022 in the journal Applied Animal Behaviour Science, and this short presentation will explain some of the key findings of that paper and how it links back to bird husbandry. As previously mentioned, here is the paper published open access in Applied Animal Behaviour Science, an evaluation of the time activity budgets of captive ducks compared to wild counterparts. This was a multi-institutional study that involved data collection across 3 WWT centres. It also included the help, expertise and research skills of a wide range of people, from research students to veterinary staff and to the living collections teams who helped facilitate data collection across these different centres. Being published open access means the article is free to read in full and therefore is accessible to all those interested in developing husbandry and welfare practices for their birds. When we consider wild ecology, when looking at animal husbandry and animal welfare, it's important to think about what aspects of wild ecology are most important to how we are going to keep animals and evaluate how they're being kept in zoological collections. There are some behaviours that, when performed in the wild, would be inappropriate in captivity, and other behaviours whose wild performance may actually hamper a life in captivity. This work that we have performed on captive waterfowl has focused on key behaviours that take up the majority of the bird's daily time activity budget: feeding and foraging, preening and maintenance behaviours, movement, social behaviours, and then, to get an idea of the bird's responses to the captive environment, abnormal repetitive behaviours, stereotypic behaviours as well. We have looked at different forms of foraging, different forms of activity, and different species of bird, all with different ecologies. Dabbling ducks that forage at the water's surface, diving ducks that go under the water's surface for their food, sea ducks that inhabit a very particular niche out in the wild, and then very specific species such as whistling ducks, perching ducks and stifftails, all with their own behavioural biology. And the overall aim of this research has been to understand a duck's responses to the captive environment. These birds out in the wild can be migratory. They can travel vast differences between feeding, foraging and nesting grounds, between their summertime homes and their wintering grounds. So when we keep a duck in the static environment of the zoo all year round, how does it respond to that compared to its wild counterparts? By collecting observational data across a range of different species, comparing those data to direct observations of wild birds, and looking at published literature by using a meta-analysis to re-evaluate data on wild duck time activity budgets, we've been able to understand more about how we can keep ducks in captivity so that the environment that we provide for them also provides for a naturalistic behaviour pattern. Overall, 17 species of duck housed at 3 different Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust centres were used in this research project. And these birds occupied different foraging niches in the wild, and therefore we had a range of different duck ecologies represented in the paper. The species ranged from those that were very common in captivity, such as the Chiloe widgeon, a dabbling duck from South America, to those which were less frequently seen in captivity and that occupy a very specific niche in the wild. For example, the long-tailed duck, a maritime species that is found across the Palearctic and likes cold Arctic waters. We also included species of whistling duck, such as this fulvous whistling duck, a perching species with very strong social ties between members of its flock, and the fulvous whistling duck is found in sub-Saharan Africa and in tropical South America. British native species were also included to provide a comparison to some of the captive birds. Wild tufted ducks were studied at the London Wetlands Centre. Tufted ducks are a diving species. Their legs are set far back on the body to allow them to dive underwater. We also looked at other sea duck species, such as the common goldeneye, another Palearctic species that can be found in freshwater and out at sea. It is also a diving duck. The northern pintail, a species of dabbling duck with an incredibly wide distribution across the Palearctic region, from North America across Arctic Russia into Europe. Hooded mergansers are a sawbill duck. Their bill contains serrations that allow them to catch fish. They're a diving species from North America, and they are relatively frequently seen in captive collections. The Australian shoveler is an example of a highly specialised dabbling species with a large spatula-shaped bill that it uses to filter feed microscopic organisms from the water. The Australasian shoveler occurs in Australia and New Zealand. This species was studied for wintertime data collection at WWT Slimbridge. We also looked at another species of whistling duck, the very familiar white-faced whistling duck, an incredibly popular species in captive collections. Again, a perching species with very strong social ties within its flock. The white-faced whistling duck shares the same African and South American distribution as is seen in the fulvous whistling duck. We also collected data on wild mallards, the most widespread species of wildfowl, and the northern mallard is a dabbling species that is incredibly common around humans, being adapted because it's very generalizable in its habitat requirements to the human-created environment. A third species of whistling duck was also investigated. This is the red-billed or black-bellied whistling duck from tropical North, Central and South America. Again, this is a perching species. The white-headed duck, the male is at the front of this photograph and the female behind, is a stiff tail. You can see that from the erect tail feathers in the photograph. Stiff tails are incredibly aquatic, spending most of their time on the water. Their legs are set right to the rear of their bodies, so they move excellently on and underwater, but cannot walk well on land. Another specialised sea duck is the common scoter, a Palearctic species that occurs off the coast of the United Kingdom. Common scoters are often found in deeper water where they dive to collect shellfish. The final whistling duck species included was the Cuban or West Indian or black-billed whistling duck, the largest species of whistling duck from the tropical Caribbean. Again, another perching species. The common eider is the most commonly kept sea duck in captivity. It can dive to great depths to collect mussels and other shellfish. Common eiders are a sea duck species. They require deep, cold water to remain healthy when kept in captivity. The hardhead is an Australasian species, a diving duck similar to the pottards and tufted duck. This species of bird, again, has legs set far back on its body that allows it to dive with efficiency under the water. And finally, another highly specific species, the Harlequin duck, with exacting habitat requirements of cold Arctic waters, a sea duck that is commonly found off the coast of Iceland. Representatives of these types of birds allow us for direct comparison with the wild literature, with other captive collections, and with wild observations of dabbling ducks and diving ducks. With the exception of the Australasian shoveler and a population of common goldeneye, all birds were recorded during the spring and summer. The key finding from this research is that ducks in captivity display incredibly low to zero rates of their time on abnormal repetitive behaviours. So even though some aspects of their movement are restricted and their enclosures may not yield the same variety as wild wetlands will do, they are not coping with this more static environment by performing abnormal repetitive behaviours. So from a behavioural perspective, some of the welfare that is inbuilt into captive husbandry is good. One of the things that we do need to look at in more detail are how birds respond to the captive environment by being inactive. High levels of inactivity are seen in captive ducks compared to their wild counterparts. This may be a response to the captive environment that is neutral. The animal is provided with shelter, care and food, so maybe it doesn't need to move around as much as a wild bird. But it could also indicate learned helplessness or apathy. The bird is simply not stimulated to move, so therefore it has lost that part of its time activity budget, and it spends more time preening and resting because it knows it can do these things within the confines of the captive environment. So a future research question should be to look at the impacts of inactivity on bird well-being. The key outputs from this paper are summarised in this diagram. Key predictors of differences in time activity budgets of wild ducks were season, sex of the bird, and species. Obviously, different species doing different things are going to have to provide different amounts of time to different behaviours. Dabbling ducks, for example, may spend more time foraging than diving ducks because they consume a less energy-dense food. Season will also play a difference, with courtship behaviour and breeding behaviour confined to very specific times of the year. And because wildfowl go into the moult and change their behaviour over the course of summer when they are flightless, their time activity budgets reflect this. The commonest behaviours that we saw were foraging in the published dataset on wild birds, alert in our direct observations of wild birds, and resting in the captive birds. Alert may be because the wild birds we observed were in a nature reserve that was visited by humans, and this may disturb the birds whilst they are undertaking their normal daily activity budgets. Resting as the commonest behaviour in captive birds needs further investigation. Is this simply a behaviour that is performed because there is little need for extra foraging, or is it a sign of lethargy, apathy or boredom, and therefore potentially a welfare problem? We can't say this from the dataset in this paper, but it is worthwhile considering for future studies. Key predictors of differences in captive time budgets were season and sex, the same as we have seen in wild birds, but interestingly time of day, with birds displaying different amounts of time on activity according to whether or not it was morning, midday or afternoon. Many wildfowl exhibit a period of loafing in the middle of the day, which is when we see extended periods of inactivity. Coupled with a lack of opportunities for foraging, this change in activity with time of day is another future avenue of research. No report of abnormal behaviour was seen in captive eiders, harlequin ducks, white-faced whistling ducks or scoters, suggesting that the husbandry and enclosures provided for these species enabled them to perform species-typical behaviours without the need to resort to any form of coping mechanism in the form of abnormal repetitive or stereotypic behaviour. Hearteningly, overall, there are negligible rates of abnormal repetitive behaviours observed in captive birds. We defined abnormal repetitive behaviours as pacing along a fence line, continued attempts at flight or escape, or other aberrant behaviours that would not be documented in the wild. No reports of abnormal repetitive behaviours for wild birds were found in our set of wild literature, and we observed no occurrences of abnormal behaviour in the wild mallards or tufted ducks observed for this study. Overall, it's really positive to see that captive ducks do not display high levels of abnormal repetitive behaviour, and therefore the husbandry observed is potentially relevant and useful to the species that are being managed. We observed seasonal changes in the activity patterns for both diving and dabbling ducks, where we had our direct comparison of wild and captive birds. We also noted some differences in the taxonomy of the birds and their behaviour, with wild diving ducks spending the most time resting, and the highest rate of foraging reported for wild sea ducks. Again, this is likely a facet of foraging and behavioural ecology. High protein dense foods that contain a lot of energy means these types of birds are likely to be able to spend extended periods of time resting, and high rates of foraging for sea ducks are likely because to find these highly nutritious patches of food, they have to travel long distances over wide spaces in the ocean. Finally, we noted some extraneous effects on behaviour, in that visitors increase movement in captive birds, which may be because visitors in some WWT centres for some enclosures have the opportunity to feed the birds, and visitors also increase movement patterns and socialisation in wild birds, and this may be linked to instances of alert becoming increased with visitation, increased movement and the flock coming together as a defensive mechanism against the presence of humans. However, we need to measure this in more detail to provide further reliable and concrete support for that idea. Ecological suitability of enclosures is not something that is just applicable to waterfowl. Any species that has evolved to a particular habitat in the wild should have parts of that habitat that are functional and useful to the animal replicated in the zoo. In the case of lechwe, a swamp antelope, a sandyard is probably not the best representation of the resources that this species would access out in the wild. It's really important that part of animal welfare assessment considers the things that we provide to the animals, the inputs. And whilst a resource-based approach to welfare is only part of a welfare assessment, it helps to promote positive welfare because an ecologically relevant environment will stimulate natural behaviour patterns. Such research becomes more important as we change husbandry and management practices, for example around the ethics of flight restraint, whether or not birds are capable of performing species-typical and naturalistic time activity patterns when they are housed in enclosures which require them to be pinioned or wing-clipped. The research that we have conducted into the time that ducks spend on particular behaviours allows us to determine what is constrained by an enclosure and whether or not behaviours that are constrained should be further researched to find out how this potentially impacts on animal welfare. This then provides us with evidence for the most appropriate form of housing for that particular species that enables it to perform the fullest and most naturalistic time activity budget when managed under human care. Overall, this paper has shown the usefulness of comparing the wild to captivity, of how meta-analyses across different species can provide useful information on what captive animals should be doing out in the wild and what they are able to do when housed under human care. We have shown that wild duck time activity budgets differ from those of captive individuals, and that captive birds are much more sedentary and inactive when compared to wild birds. We have shown that as a marker of welfare, abnormal repetitive behaviours were low to almost existent to non-existent across our captive species. Further study into the type of abnormal behaviour and how we measured it might be useful in shedding light in some of the occurrences of abnormal repetitive behaviour that we observed. We noted that environmental conditions, sex conditions, drake or duck, and seasonal variables, spring, summer, autumn or winter, all significantly impact on duck behaviour. And further researchers should unpick this at the species-specific level in different captive collections to find out more about the impacts of these variables on what ducks like to do and what they can do within their captive enclosures. Ultimately, our paper provides useful information on how ducks that are flight restrained and therefore are contained in open-topped enclosures, how they partition their time, how they respond to the husbandry they are provided with, and how we can look at some of the interesting findings, for example, the amount of time spent inactive, and further develop species-relevant husbandry and enclosure design for these species that ultimately are very common in captive collections.